From 1918 to 1937, something miraculous happened in New York City. In an area of 1.4 miles and 48 blocks, an entire cultural, social, literary movement, an upheaval occurred that would create such a resounding moment that to this day we are still beholden in so many ways to what emanated from the Harlem Renaissance in Harlem, New York. And one of those individuals who still to this very day is prescient and is just powering her way to the hearts of Generation Z and to those of us who are way from Generation Z is Zora Neale Hurston. We're going to take a look through her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She is, what can I say, a paragon of that period. She was popular during her time period. She fell out of favor, almost fell into complete obscurity, and just exploded in the 1970s and has not stopped to this day. So let's go on a journey through Their Eyes Were Watching God, written by the phenomenal Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, in so many ways, was atypical because her family, both father and mother, supported their children, encouraged their children, particularly her mother. Her mother just simply allowed her imagination to fly, and her mother told her that the sky was the limit and to always push herself to do all that she could do. And Zora took that to heart. She went to school just like all the other kids. She also attended college, first at Howard University, transferring in 1924 to Barnard College, a part of Columbia University. And it's there at Barnard that she receives her PhD in anthropology after also being an English major. She was also the first Black student at Barnard, and she just simply soared and understood that she was on a mission, not just to be an English major, but to study the way people sound, to study their culture, their heritage, the oral traditions. Where did we come from? How did we get here? So combine all of that into this powerhouse woman who could actually turn it into writing books. So one of those books is Their Eyes Were Watching God. And what's so fascinating is the response that critics gave her during that time period. So let's think about and talk about how Black critics saw her, white critics saw her, liked, didn't like, and moving forward to the 21st century. So here she is, she's writing not like County Cullen, the poet of the period, the Black Keats as he was called, but Zora blends the South and her experiences in the South with her experiences in the Northeast. And she brings the character and the culture and the sound and the language of the South into her work in the Northeast and specifically into New York. And for some of them, that was a very different kind of literature. It certainly wasn't what Langston Hughes was writing, wasn't what W.B. Du Bois was writing. And so you had even some Black writers of the period saying, we don't want that Southern stuff. You know, you left that back in the South. That was slavery, emancipation. We're done with that. Zora, on the other hand, said, no, you have to have a wider, palette. You have to understand the totality of the United States. What did Southerners, and I am one, what did Southerners bring to the Northeast and to the West Coast even that they didn't have? So that she was looking at the totality of that tapestry of our differences and our similarities. So she was roundly criticized in so many ways and yet praised in so many ways during her own period. What's fascinating is that the negative criticisms didn't stop her. It was almost as though she needed it in order to keep moving and to keep creating. And it just didn't matter. It's one of the things I admire about Zora Neale Hurston, because her work, particularly Their Eyes Were Watching God, focused not only on women, but it focused on voice and identity and creating oneself and creating a point of view and challenges, life's challenges that you have to deal with and still get up and come back. It dealt with community. What does community look like? What did it look like? What does it look like? And turmoil and death and love. She brought all of that into that novel. And it was popular for a time, and then it just totally, as I said, some Black critics just simply blasted her for that novel. They just absolutely did not want to see anything like the South in their world of the Harlem Renaissance. And so didn't stop her, but it did put a sort of a chill on her work until the 70s. And with the 70s, there was Hurston had her own Renaissance. You could call it the Zora Neale Hurston Renaissance, because Alice Walker decided that she needed to rethink Zora Neale Hurston and try to find out more about her. And it's so interesting that in her work, Alice Walker coins a new word. She coins the word womanist. And it's juxtaposed to feminist, but it's packing a bigger punch. So, for example, in her definition of womanist is wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered, quote, good for one, interested in grown-up doings, acting grown up, being grown up, interchangeable with another Black folk expression, you trying to be grown, responsible, in charge, serious. That describes a whole new concept of feminism, a woman who is a womanist. I make my own decisions. I choose. I get to choose. I get to decide. I get to drive the train. And it's not overpowering people. It's just simply saying, I am here. I am a person. And being a teacher for so long, I find it fascinating that when I work with high school students with this novel, particularly now with Gen Zers, the young ladies and young men and everyone just simply gravitate towards that whole notion of voice. They don't care about the gender. It's about what happens. It's about taking control. It's about having your own point of view and being respected for that. One can have differences, but it's this idea of voice and choice and making one's self known and identified. Another person who talks about Zora Neale Hurston is Henry Louis Gates Jr. He comes out with his own version of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And at its conclusion, he has an essay. And I want to read a portion of the last paragraph because, again, it encapsulates how this woman who started this amazing streak like a firebrand across the sky falls out of favor, dies, and has absolutely no knowledge. People have no knowledge of her for a very long time, and then bam, she's back. Here's what Henry Louis Gates says. The excavation of her buried life helped a new generation read Hurston again. She plowed up some literacy and laid by some alphabets. Her importance rests with the legacy of fiction and lore she constructed so cannily. As Hurston herself noted, roll your eyes in ecstasy and ape his every move, but until we have placed something upon his secret corner that is our own, we are right back where we were when we filed our iron collar off. She does not leave Black literature empty. If her earlier obscurity and neglect today seem inconceivable, perhaps now, as she wrote of Moses, she has crossed over. And she did. Hurston leaves us with a wealth of novels, of short stories, of folklore. She is an amazing woman, as Cheryl Wall calls her, a literary anthropologist who blurred and merged the boundaries of literature and ethnography into literature. So we'll see you and we'll delve back into Their Eyes Were Watching God. I always tell students and teachers and myself in my own research that no author, musician or anyone else in that matter, but no author lives in a vacuum. One doesn't just write and not have to rely on history or social movements or geographical locations or cultural movements. So this section is about connections, social studies to the rest of us, about the geography, about the cultural movements, about the social economic movements, and about the history. Places made a big deal with Zora. So Eatonville, Florida was her first large influence on her life. And then, of course, New York with the Harlem Renaissance. And with that is the mixture of what we call the lost generation of writers. And then with that, the Great Migration that literally started, or I shouldn't even say started, because there was a black middle class, teeny tiny in the 19th century, but a larger influx of people who would really combine to make the black middle class come to life in the 1920s. So let's start with where she started, Eatonville. Eatonville was the first incorporated town in 1887. And that's important because unlike so many of us who are of color or white, we didn't grow up in a town that was just one race. And in Eatonville, Zora grew up in a town that was completely 100% African American. And so those values, those sounds, those voices, the culture, the comportment, the rearing of children, the community writ large had an amazing impact on the woman, on the writer, on the playwright, the essayist, the poet that she would become. And even more important, it was all of those inputs that she had in Eatonville, Florida, that she consciously carried with her to New York. And she infused, as Cheryl Wall said, she infused her culture, her Southern culture, and its sound and its beliefs and its perspectives into this tapestry of what was going on in New York. So Eatonville was her ground zero and always her research home. She pulled on that. She relied on that. So as we read, their eyes were watching God. Eatonville is what she's alluding to, where Tea Cake wants to take Janie to Eatonville. And the Harlem Renaissance juxtaposed to Eatonville was something completely different for Zora. It was, as some say in Great Britain, posh. Harlem was just a posh place. And so in all of New York, you had this bubble of poshness with black people. You know, clubs, restaurants, a middle class, and it was popping all the time. I mean, it was, I can only imagine, you know, at the salons that they used to have during the Lost Generation in Paris, the salons that were in Harlem at that time, because it was a constant conversation of psychology, of philosophy, of art, of music. I mean, it was just an amazing array. Jazz pops out, the Roaring Twenties pops out, and it's just a new way of thinking, and in so many ways, empowerment, which is what guided W.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke to talk about the new Negro. Now, what do we talk about when we say the new Negro? It's different from the slaves, from freedmen and freemen who were enslaved. This is a new kind of person who is evolving now. And you have these talented tenth, the chosen ones, to discern and to define what those people are and what their tasks are. And in Du Bois's mind, the goal of the Harlem Renaissance was to take those talented tenth or the chosen ones and hone them to such an extent that everything they did would be the paragon of an exemplar. That this is what every African American should aspire to. The education, the conversation, I think back to what I had to do as a child, learn all of the quote, the decorums of being a young lady, you know. So you want to remember that this is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to dress. This is how you're going to eat. This is what you're going to read. That was the Harlem Renaissance, totally antithetical to Eatonville. Eatonville was the southern part. It had the dialect. It had just the down home. If you're hungry, come on in and have some food. Don't worry about it. That's what we do on Sundays. We invite everybody in. That was not the Harlem Renaissance. And here we have Zora Neale Hurston saying, you know, what happens if you conjoin the two? And that, of course, created a huge issue for some of them. But others actually really liked it. And even Elaine Locke, who wrote The New Negro, included one of Zora Neale Hurston's stories in his book, in his collection, Spunk, in 1925. He absolutely loved it. However, as Zora continued to rise and aspire and really distinguish herself as that womanist that Alice Walker talks about, even Elaine Locke said, I can't go there. I can't. Well, all the dialect and stuff, we're trying to get away from that. We don't want that. Didn't stop Zora at all. She kept going. The lost generation, I always like for teachers and students to know that the lost generation of writers such as Hemingway, such as Dos Passos, such as, Steinbeck, those individuals, all of them crossed roads with the Harlem Renaissance folks. And I'm always fascinated when students don't understand that the Harlem Renaissance didn't stand on its own alone, and that the lost generation, Faulkner and the others, didn't stand on their own alone. The Harlem Renaissance folks were going abroad to Paris, just like the lost generation folks. They all had the salons with, like Gertrude Stein, they were all mixing. And when you mix like that, you're also sharing thoughts and discovering new ideas and talking and taking those ideas and thoughts and conversations back to apply to your own writing or your own art or your own music. So it was an amazing period in American literary history that you have this cultural movement that is just like, I think of it as a tsunami, that is just a wave that literally does not touch the rest of the United States. That's the great irony. It's all concentrated in New York and abroad. To really talk about that, George Schuyler, another writer and publisher, writes The Art of Negro Hokum. And in response, Langston Hughes, of course, writes The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, each talking about how the Negro at the time, African Americans, what challenges did they have in the terms of trying to become a novelist, a playwright, a musician, an artist? That they put those into publications. And again, as you'll find out, you'll have copies of both of those very important essays to see the comparison and the contrast with the Harlem Renaissance and with the lost generation and with people like Schuyler and Langston Hughes. Something amazing begins to happen. African Americans from the South start migrating to the Northeast. And it's called the Great Migration. They simply leave the South because why? They want a better life. They want to become a part of the American dream. And what's fascinating at this time, while the Great Migration is happening, the Harlem Renaissance is happening, and the Lost Generation all coming together along with jazz and the Roaring Twenties, if you are a movie buff, you can actually find old films of African Americans. I mean, this was a time when Lena Horne and Cab Calloway were doing films, and Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather, all of those. So African Americans could actually go to theaters and see themselves. So they had books now also, like Hurston's, to see themselves. And those moving from the South to the North, particularly with Their Eyes Were Watching God, could hear themselves. So they didn't have to leave their culture behind. They could still be proud to be from the South. When I first started talking to students about other novels that use dialect, like Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I will use my own dialect in Texas that I heard growing up. And one of the examples that I use that I absolutely love and that kids love is to tell them how, even in Texas itself, if you're in Houston, where I grew up, you don't really hear the dialect. But if you're in West Texas, the word Hair becomes har. And for me, it was hair. So going to West Texas, it was like going to the other side of the moon. And asking my parents, what did he say? And my mother saying, don't say anything. It's okay. We'll talk about that later. So that's the kind of conundrum that Zora Neale Hurston had to write in. She was bringing the South, the sound of it, the taste of it, the challenges of it, to a very sophisticated place and letting us know that we're all in this world together and can learn from each other. And so this whole concept of connections, of the history, of the location, of the culture, and all of that informing her writing, very important. So let's not forget about the social studies connections. When teaching Their Eyes Are Watching God, of course, as English teachers, we have to think about thematic threads. We have to think about style. We have to think about point of view. We also have to think about writing and, of course, some of the characters, or maybe all of them, but for me, just some of them, because we're going to focus on just a few of them. The thematic threads are always something that we are required to pay attention to. And part of what makes Hurston such a visionary, and bringing her Floridian background into her new environment of New York and the Harlem Renaissance, are the thematic threads on which she chooses to focus. And as we go through them, you're going to find that part of this emanates literally back from what her mother taught her and what she experienced in Eatonville, the concept of voice and identity. Yes, during this period, African Americans were in the Northeast defining and discovering themselves and their voices. There was a rising Black middle class. So voice and identity were important. Among women, white, Black, brown, this was beginning to stir like a boil of wanting to have a voice and a singular identity, versus the old days of a woman didn't have a voice or didn't have an identity because once she married, she became a part of her husband. So the other point or thematic thread that adds to this voice and identity is the concept of non-victimization. You read Du Bois, you read Locke, you read Langston Hughes, you read any number of those writers, and even with the work of the artists, and yes, the musicians, this vibrancy of non-victimization. We're going to create our path. We're going to do what we think we can do, and we're going to support the United States of America. So you have that sense of we're not the victims. The self-worth. No looking down at the shoes or scuffling along or jumping to the other side of the street. When you look at images and movies from that period, you see a class of people who are proud of themselves. For example, and one of my favorite sci-fi films, The Day the Earth Stood Still, when you have a pan of the people watching the spaceship, ironically, you see faces of color, which I always love, because being an old B-50 sci-fi person, you don't really see that many people of color. But in The Day the Earth Stood Still, you see these people who are in the Black middle class. And so that idea of the self-worth runs through Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Janie never does not think about her own self-worth. Also, the term womanist comes back, a term that, of course, Alice Walker coins first, but in so many ways, she coins it because Zora Neale Hurston lived it and practiced it. So the idea of the subtle tension between the writers, the male writers of the Harlem Renaissance and the women writers of the Harlem Renaissance became very palpable during this time period. And women like Zora Neale Hurston and Anna Julia Cooper, for example, pushed back. I want to share one quote with Anna Julia Cooper that will resonate with you and with Zora Neale Hurston. She says in her in her work, A Voice from the South, if black men are a muffled chord, then black women are the mute and voiceless note of the race with no language but a cry. Just as Anna Julia Cooper fought against that, so did Zora with a passion. And she did not make any apologies to anyone. And you can see that in her style of writing. You can also see it when she brings her Floridian background from Eatonville to intersect and merge into a new tapestry of writing. So, for example, as you read the novel, you're going to read that it's in dialect. It's in not just Southern dialect, it is in Floridian Southern dialect, which is totally different from, for example, my home state, totally different from Georgia, totally different from Mississippi. So those dialects, students who are from the North or the Northwest or the West Coast or whatever can now hear how those individuals sound, their dialect of who they are, not anyone else's voice. The same would be with slang. Only Zora creates the glossary of Harlem slang. And so she decides, because linguistics, remember, she's an anthropologist, so language becomes important. So she wants people to hear how folks sound. And our students today will resonate with that because they have their own slang and their own dialect that even extends to their texting. So it's an interesting way of explaining dialect and slang to students if you bring in their emojis, their shortcuts, their terms. So that would be an interesting activity that we actually flesh out later on in strategies. She also brought in something from the South in terms of sermons and hymns, the old 100s, so to speak, that she grew up with. So important. One of the other traits in her style, for which even Langston Hughes criticized her for, as well as W.B. Du Bois, the oral culture of the South, and even of Haiti, for example, because she studied those languages and wanted to hear the rhythms. And what many in the Harlem Renaissance wanted was to move away from, quote, the country and the South and really embrace in totality what New York and the Upper East, Upper West Sides represented. Zora came with a different plan. The plan was, we're going to take the South and the stories I grew up with, the old wives' tales, the voodoo stuff that I grew up hearing, the whole concept of the old stories that are passed down from generation to generation. I'm going to take all of that I heard. I'm going to take what I learned in Haiti. I'm going to take what I learned in other places, and I'm going to create a kind of oral tradition that I can merge with the urbanity of New York and create all of my works. And she does that, not just in Their Eyes Were Watching God, it spans throughout the entirety of her work. And to be honest, it drove W.B. Du Bois nuts because he simply did not like that kind of writing. And as I said, even Elaine Locke at one point finally said, I've had enough, I can't go down that path anymore. But they were wrong. And they were wrong because we're not just one tapestry in this country. We are a multitude of tapestries. And the job of the author, the artist, as Joyce says, James Joyce, is to reflect that. And that's what Hurston does. And she does it so well in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Her point of view, for example, is not just a simple first person, second person, third person omniscient. It's a filtered narration. What is that? Well, the filtered narration seems like it's third person, but what we're absolutely hearing are first person recognitions and words. And that wasn't done, hadn't been done since the 19th century in Wuthering Heights. That was the last time the filtered narration had been actually used. And Hurston does it so well. And it is a kind of narration where even though it's a third party telling it, you're getting the first person words. So we feel like Janie is saying absolutely what we think we hear her saying, although it's a third person. The other part is that the writing is so tight and it's so good. She covers, one of the things I like when teaching writing is to tell students that there is no such thing as just persuasive writing. Every time we open our mouths or do anything, we're in the art of persuasion. If I say hello, what I'm expecting is a hello back. I don't always get it, but that's what I want. That's an art of persuasion. It's an act of persuasion. So when you read Their Eyes Were Watching God, it is narrative, absolutely, but it's also description. It's also exposition. It's also persuasion. She has definition and illustrations in it. And one of the strategies, when we get to strategies that I like, is how Hurston plays with language. She has a way of creating new words. That is called neologism. Then she has a way of blending words, and that's called anthemeria. And what I want to read to you is one of the only people to really interview her. She had interviews with ones that, but the one that we can get is an interview with McBride. And McBride praised and inquired about Hurston's use of the phrase friended with. Now, I know this is the 21st century, and our students already have that word, friended, befriended, but what they don't know is that it wasn't in existence when Hurston was writing. It was brand new. And the interviewer says, I just don't understand. How did you come with friended? And Hurston's response, yes, making verbs out of nouns. We black Southerners do that a lot. And I always laugh when I read that because I think that, well, even Zora was off a little bit. Anthemeria was developed by the Greeks and the Romans because it's a rhetorical term, because they were already playing with the use of words. And what could you do with words? How could you expand them, contract them, conjoin them, change them? As you know, she takes the noun friend and makes it into a verb. And think about it, how language changes. It was brand new then, totally hot off the presses. And now in 2023, our students will look at that and say, it's not a new word. It's not a new word at all. So that's the kind of writing that she did, and that she does, that it still emanates. The characters we'll be focusing on, of course, are Janie and Logan and Jody, and most importantly, the communities of Florida in which she grew, the community of New York where she flourished, and then her conjoining, her understanding that the only way she could make meaning in her work, including in Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is so prescient today, is by providing that tapestry where she interweaves Eatonville and Harlem. Thanks. Challenges. Books have always been challenged. And one of the things that teachers always have to think about is, how is a book going to play out in a classroom with students, with parents? Zora Neale Hurston, when she published Their Eyes Were Watching God, didn't have to have or even think about that kind of challenge. Her challenges with her book, particularly Their Eyes Were Watching God, was from her own contemporaries. Both black and white criticized the book. Both black and white praised the book. Part of what the critics said they hated about the book was Hurston's zeal, her commitment to bringing in and interweaving the South, her heritage, the sound of her heritage, the experiences of her heritage into the Harlem Renaissance moment. And she does that. And that doesn't go over so well with so many of her contemporaries, including one who once praised her, Elaine Locke. Fast forward to where we are now, our challenges are not that, because as Hurston died, and so much of her work basically died with her for a number of years, Alice Walker resurrects it, literally. And Hurston's works, her short stories, and some of her novels, particularly Their Eyes Were Watching God, made it back into curricula around the United States. So teachers then had to navigate these particular texts. In specifics, Their Eyes Were Watching God at generally the 11th grade American Literature Survey. So the challenges for teachers is, how do you deal with students from around the country who have never really totally understood dialect, because it's difficult. They don't even recognize, students rarely recognize their own dialect. For example, living here in Massachusetts, those who are native here don't see that butter is not how I pronounce butter, or the way it's pronounced someplace else. That's the way Massachusetts natives speak. Apartment is apartment. And I love that, but it's their dialect. And that's what Hurston brings to Their Eyes Were Watching God, a deep Southern and African American dialect, and integrates that. So you have to navigate with students the dialect. I usually practice. If I'm going to talk to students about a novel that has dialect in it, I am going to practice and make sure I try to get it as close as possible to what the author wanted it to be. And it's okay for students to say, it's even great for students to say, I'm uncomfortable because I don't understand it. That in itself is a learning moment, because you can talk about, well, have you listened to the dialects of wherever it is you happen to be living, whether it's the South, the West, the East, or the North? It's all the same. We have our own peculiar ways of saying certain words. The same would be true of a challenge with oral traditions. A great learning tool is to ask students to think about, or even go home and ask their parents or grandparents, were there any stories that have been passed down in the family that we just keep telling those stories all the time? And probably, more likely than not, parents or grandparents are going to say, yeah, there were some stories, but you don't want to hear them. Well, yeah, I do, because we're reading a novel where the oral tradition is a part of what we're reading. Again, it's about showing how families knit themselves together, how they knit their communities together through the oral traditions. Pushback when she first published it, again, the Harlem Renaissance literati did not really like it, half liked it, half didn't, but didn't deter Zora. She was going to go her own path. The other issue with the challenges is stereotypes. What I find so fascinating about Their Eyes Were Watching God, I'm not so sure that Zora was completely consciously aware that what she was writing would so impact the 21st century and how we understand the term stereotypes. Because Zora actually breaks the mold. She has an amazing family who loves her, who encourage her. She has this spirit fomented by her mother that she is going to succeed no matter what. She is surrounded in a community that looks like her, sounds like her, and when she goes to New York, she doesn't shave off that. She incorporates it into a multicultural, multiracial, multidimensional environment in New York. And so that the stereotypes she uses as a way of putting the stereotype in and then imploding it and creating something new. The intimacy in this novel could be off-putting for some parents, particularly now in the 21st century when we're having so many challenges to books. The idea that Janie marries and that she, doesn't love her husband, particularly Joe Stark, but she falls in love with Tea Cake and she runs off with him and they're truly in love. So you have relationships that are not quite satisfying, and then those that are satisfying with consequences. You have domestic violence in this one that can hit home for so many students, and you as a teacher may not know anything about that. And it's emotional, physical, or even psychological abuse. And all of that's in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Janie goes through all of those experiences. And to be specific, let's look at a few of those. Her mother, her familial relationships. As I said, her mother, her father, very supportive. She loses her mother at a very young age, but her mother had limitless love and joy for her. And according to Zora, Zora says, Mama exhorted her children at every opportunity to jump at the sun. We might not land on the sun, but at least we would get off the ground. That's in her memoirs, Dust Tracks. And that's the core and the nucleus that Zora carried with her until she had her final heart attack while she was still trying to write and was having onset dementia. I mean, it stayed with her, that spirit. The love interests, Joe Stark, for example, was constraining and confining. And of Jo, I'm going to read specifically what she says here in Their Eyes Were Watching God. In describing Jo to Phoebe, she says, Jody classed me off. When I wasn't in the store, he wanted me to just sit with folded hands and sit there. And I'd sit there with the walls creeping up on me and squeezing all the life out of me. Sitting still worries me. All I want's to utilize myself all over. And if those sentiments do not describe Zora Neale Hurston, I don't know what does. She wanted to utilize herself all over. And in every text, every essay, every letter, you can see that. Every short story, that's what she's doing. And she's so ahead of her time. And so Joe Stark becomes that image of a man who wanted a woman just to be there for him. And that she was thinking, it just wasn't something that she wanted to do. And just for a little history, 19th century women, regardless of race, had the same issue. The only difference is in the 19th century, particularly in Great Britain, they would put the women in sanatoriums because the brighter, the more intelligent they were, there had to be something wrong with them. So they put them away. Joe Stark just constrained her and she left. Tea Cake comes along and he is the love of her life. And she talks about how wonderful Tea Cake is. And I wanted to read a section to you that I think is just so poignant about Tea Cake. She has to kill him because he contracts rabies. And the town thinks that she killed him and there's a trial and everything and she's exonerated. So she gives Tea Cake a massive funeral and the town really feels badly that they even thought badly of her. And so she finishes the funeral, she comes home and she's alone for the first time. The day of the gun and the bloody body and the courthouse came and commenced to sing a sobbing sigh out of every corner in the room, out of each and every chair and thing. Commenced to sing, commenced to sob and sigh, singing and sobbing. Then Tea Cake came prancing around her where she was, and the song of the sigh flew out of the window and lit up the top of the trees. Tea Cake with the sun for a shawl. Of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead until she herself had finished feeling and thinking. That is about love. And of her mother in death, because the death of Tea Cake, of her mother in death, she said, Mama died at sundown and changed the world. That hour began my wanderings, not so much in geography, but in time. Not so much in time as in spirit. These are the challenges, the wonderful challenges that confront students, and we can use this novel to deal with that and to give voice to it for our students. We're going to deal further as we move along in the other sections to come. Now that we've talked about the novel, being a classroom teacher, of course, my next question would be, okay, so how do we do this? So we have some strategies to suggest. And even after we complete this segment, really know that you can always reach out and we're always willing to help or give you some suggestions. But one of the issues with this novel is that you don't have to teach the entirety of the novel. Yes, I would prefer that you teach the entirety of the novel, but the novel itself can be taught in excerpts, even to 10th and 11th, 10, 9, 10, 11, 12th grade students. The entire novel, of course, should rest in the American Literary Survey, but it should be used. The novel is so important, particularly now. So as you think about revisiting Zora, think about the reading choices, excerpts versus the entirety of the piece. The other idea is when you start reading, do some pre-reading. Prep the students, do some exploratory work, just as we did about the period itself. Introduce the period to them, introduce some of the sounds and some of the people. They're already studying some of them, as discussed earlier, poets like Count T. Cullen and Langston Hughes. So they have some idea, but they don't have the cohesive and coherent idea of the import of the Harlem Renaissance itself. So that would be worth going back and revisiting. There is another idea that both John and I came up with, and it was the idea of meeting Zora Hurston's Harlem Renaissance connections. Remember, we've always said you cannot read literature and not bring in social studies. It is just a marriage that has to happen and has to stay intact. And so the Harlem Renaissance scene, creating and fomenting a cultural movement, that's what happened in the Harlem Renaissance. There was a cultural movement, and Zora Neale Hurston was a keen part of that and has become an icon of that because she is so prescient in the 21st century. Her work is so prescient. So this idea of creating and fomenting a cultural movement, once all of those writers, musicians, artists, and just the environment itself coalesced, nothing stayed the same anymore. All that began started influencing movements like the civil rights movement, the feminist movement. All of it, you could see it, you could smell it, you could taste it every day in Harlem during this time period. And it's so important that students understand that this was a real movement. It was substantive. It was important. It was critical. And there are parts of me that just don't want us all to forget about not just the lost generation as was discussed before, but also the Harlem Renaissance and the great migration that was impacted because of the lost generation and the Harlem Renaissance. So this activity of Meeting Zora's Harlem is the idea of bringing students together and giving them choices and say, okay, now that you've read an excerpt out of Their Eyes Were Watching God, how about we divide up and you choose someone you'd like to focus on? It can be Zora Neale Hurston. It can be another writer, a musician whom you like. You have students who like music, so tap into that. Let them hear some of the music and see some of the musicians, who were of that period. The artists, the artwork is phenomenal. So you may have some drawers and, the graphic novels in your classroom. The environment. John and I had conversations about this one, and I wanted to do the food, and he looked at me, and then he said, the culture. I said, yes, that's it. One's culture sometimes is wrapped up in food. In the 21st century, we are awash in programming about food and culture. So what was the food and culture of the Harlem Renaissance? And what is the food and culture of some of your kids in your classes? So allow them to use Their Eyes Were Watching God as a jumping off point to start there and then build on top of it. So what do you get if you try this activity? Well, it supports reading, it supports critical inquiry, it supports writing, research, collaboration, inquiry, and it is absolutely cross-curricular. There's cross-curricular integration. And then you have them report out and share and talk. Now that's true experience of literature. That's the power of what literature and social studies can do together. The final portion of this segment is primary and secondary resources. We can never get enough of them. And you, as teachers teaching 5 days a week, I know what it was like. I used to grade papers in my car, at a stop sign, a stoplight, any place I was grading papers. What we have in the final portion of this pilot is that we want you to have a list of resources that you can go to like that. And we will have the primary sources so that it won't be just Zora's novels. We'll have the short stories with recommendations for middle school, like the story Spunk or the Gilded Sixpence or the short story Sweat, which are easily for middle schoolers. And then the novels, her memoirs, some of her letters, which are really very interesting. But in addition to that, and just as important, the secondary resources. Some of the critics whose works you've heard, or the comments you've heard, like Henry Louis Gates Jr. or Cheryl Wall. You'll also have links to an interview that Hurston gave about Their Eyes Were Watching God, and we discussed that with McBride. There will also be links there where you and your students can use Google's Arts and Culture, so that Google's Arts and Culture is free. You can go in and put in Zora Neale Hurston, and you can see a wealth of images, virtual tours of Harlem, and give them a sense of being able to drill a bit further into who this woman was. As well as, if you're doing the Meeting Zora's Harlem Renaissance, you can bring up entire collections of works by the artists, by the musicians. Internet Archives, for example, is another link that's included in this resource section that will help you access the books. Sometimes they now have films that we talked about, the films like Lena Horne, Cabin in the Sky, Duke Ellington. That's all on Internet Archives, and it is open source. So we're trying to provide at your fingertip resources so that you don't have to stay up, spend money, and just drive yourself crazy trying to find the prescient and the spot-on resources that you need. They're done for you. And again, if you hit a snag, you can always reach out, and we will promise always to answer back.